Hey there, and welcome. Thanks for being here. In this video, we're going to talk about why the specific number of reps you do in any set of resistance training doesn't really matter so much, and we're going to talk about what actually matters more. So briefly, the plan for this video is to discuss the current research on the subject, and like I said, what matters, what doesn't. Another way to say it is that we're going to talk about what was thought to matter and what is now actually understood to matter. This is the primary paper upon which I'm going to base most of the claims that I make in this video. I'll go ahead and link this down below if you're interested in checking that out. There are other references that I'm going to cite to support some of the things that I plan to say, but this is the primary paper. And then to conclude the video, we'll finish with some practical reasons of why you might choose one repetition range over another. So let's get started with what was thought to matter. And what was thought to matter was this idea called the repetition continuum. And this is basically the idea that low reps, heavy weight, something like 1 to 6 reps or so, is specific for building strength. Moderate reps, moderate weight, something like 6 to 12, 8 to 12 reps is specific for building muscle size, hypertrophy. And higher reps, usually most sources will say something like 15 plus reps is specific for building muscular endurance. And what the difference between muscular endurance and normal endurance is, we'll talk about once we get to that section of the video. Now, as it kind of alludes to, this idea, the repetition continuum, is largely based on the idea that these are distinct adaptations that you can choose at the cost of one another. There were a few papers, I think in the 40s or 50s, that kind of alluded to this idea, and at face value, it makes somewhat mechanistic sense. And, for the better part of over half a century, the 40s and 50s were more than a decade ago, this has been taken as seemingly an absolute truth. The problem is that those early papers didn't take into account a number of different confounding variables, of which we'll talk about, and a lot more research has been done on the subject, and a very different picture has now been painted. So we're going to go through each of those different adaptations, hypertrophy, strength, and endurance. In that order, we'll go through those, and cover what was thought to matter, reiterate, and then talk about what matters. So again, hypertrophy, what was thought to matter was moderate reps, moderate weight, something like 8 to 12 was specific for hypertrophy. What has been shown to be the case is that anywhere from 5 to 30 reps will produce the same results if RPE and RIR are equated. So RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion. It's a fancy way of saying how hard you're trying on a scale from 1 to 10. So RPE 8 would be in reference to an 8 out of 10 subjective effort. IR stands for repetitions in reserve. And so that's exactly what it sounds like. It is the number of reps you could have done in a set before you reached muscular failure when you stopped. So if you finish a set and you could have cranked out 2 more reps before you hit, that wall muscular failure, that would be RIR, repetitions in reserve 2. So in other words, if you're doing a set and you go to the point where you could do 2 more reps and you can't do any more past that, but you stop 2 reps shy of failure, it does not matter if you do 5 and you could have done 7, or if you do 15 and you could have done 17. The results you see in terms of muscle growth will be pretty much identically the same between those 2 sets. In other words, it is not the specific number of reps that you do that matters in a set. It's really just how hard you try, how close to failure you get. For hypertrophy specifically, again, muscle growth, the sweet spot has been shown to be somewhere between 1 to 3 reps shy of hitting true muscular failure is when results start to be maxed out. But if you get within that range, it does not really matter too much how many reps you do in that set. Now, the reason I listed 5 to 30 here is because that's all that's been tested in the research. So it's the only rep range that I can report on with any degree of confidence. It's possible this would be true for 3 reps or 33 reps. Just there isn't evidence on that. So I don't want to say that with any real degree of confidence. For muscular strength, again, the previous thought is that low reps, the weight, something like 1 to 6, is specific for strength adaptations. And the relationship here is pretty much the same as for hypertrophy, at least for 95% of the results of strength improvement that you'll see. So just to kind of reiterate it, the improvement in strength that you see on any given lift will be the same whether you do 5 reps or 10 reps or 15 reps if you're getting as close to failure in each of those sets. Now, in regard to maximal strength expression, there are a few other pieces of nuance that are worth considering. This neuromuscular component, basically this just means how much of a muscle is your nervous system actually activating in any given lift. And so, for example, if you take an untrained person, someone who's not previously been doing any training, and they begin a strength training program, for about the first 6 weeks or so, the results they see in strength improvement will come from your nervous system activating more of that muscle and activating more of that contractile tissue, and not necessarily adding more muscle or more contractile tissue. There is also a skill component to maximal strength expression. So for every person, there is some technique that is going to be most efficient for you to lift any weight. Your skill in that technique has to be that much more refined when you're using lower reps like a 1 rep max, a 2 rep max, than it needs to be if you're doing higher reps like a 15 rep set. And this is one of the things that kind of muddies the research on this topic. And so, for example, in studies where they have subjects perform leg press, for example, and they're comparing low reps versus high reps on muscle growth and strength long term, they might see the lower rep set experience the same muscle growth as the higher rep set, but experience greater strength. But that's usually just because they are more skilled at lifting in the low rep ranges than the higher rep people. However, in studies where they take someone who is doing a leg press, for example, and they're comparing two people who are doing low reps and high reps, and then they do the final strength testing on a different exercise where the skill component is kind of washed out between groups, you don't really see much difference between groups. So, these sort of pieces of nuance are kind of the minutiae that make up 5% of your maximal strength expression. But for all intents and purposes, the rest of it is exactly the same as hypertrophy. And what you might be thinking is that, the adaptation of hypertrophy and strength, if the stimulus to produce them is the same, then the adaptation itself is the same. And that's really true. In other words, I don't think it is accurate to view muscle growth and strength improvements as different adaptations. They really are the same. So finally, muscular endurance. And it's worth kind of differentiating between what muscular endurance is and what you might call more systemic endurance. And so in any endurance improvement, there are really 4 hallmark adaptations that happen within your body. One of which is an increase in stroke volume, and that's just how much blood your heart is beating with every heartbeat. And so as your endurance gets better, your heart pumps more blood through your body with every heartbeat, with every beat of itself. Another thing that happens is an increase in lipolytic enzymes. And these are just the enzymes that help convert fat into fuel. Those 2 adaptations happen systemically across the whole body. In other words, it doesn't matter what kind of cardio you do or what kind of exercise you're doing or what limbs of your body are involved. Those are going to happen, equally across the entire body. The other 2 hallmark adaptations that occur in response to endurance training of any kind are an increase in capillary density. And capillaries are just the exit ramps from your main artery supply into your muscle. So it's easier for blood, oxygen, and nutrients to get from your main blood supply into the working muscle. And an increase in mitochondrial density. Mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell. That's where almost all of the energy your muscles produce is produced. Those 2 adaptations, the last 2 that I talked about, are specific to the site that is being worked. So muscular endurance only really takes into account those 2 adaptations, where systemic, normal endurance would take into account all 4 of those different adaptations. One of the things that makes studying this kind of difficult is that if you have someone take 40% of the 1 rep max and do reps to failure, which is really light, by the way, and they do that over time and they say improvements, and you keep the weight the same, that becomes now a different percent of the 1 rep max. And that's true for the other adaptations too, but it's just a bit more pronounced when you're studying muscular endurance. So it then becomes difficult to say what is the actual factor influencing any sort of muscular endurance adaptation. However, in practice, I don't really think it's worth your time to even think about muscular endurance when it comes to something like lifting weights or just, moving a weight up and down. And that's for 2 reasons that I list here. So it's highly likely that if you improve strength, you improve muscle mass, I meant to say, pulled a Mike Tyson there, that you would also see an improvement in your ability to lift a weight for a higher repetition range. And that kind of goes back to this idea that, the repetition continuum postulates that these are different adaptations from one another that you can specifically target. And I just don't think that's the case. I think they're really all the same. And that's what I would argue the state of the research supports. Another reason why I suggest you don't really think about muscular endurance when it comes to lifting weights is that the endurance improvements that you might be after will be far more effectively achieved if you use more traditional conditioning modalities, such as running, cycling, swimming, airdyne, ski erg, rower, etc., than if you were just to do really high reps of any given exercise. So that's kind of the lay of the land of what the research says in regard to if reps matter at all. That said, I do think there are some reasons that are justifiable as why you might choose a higher or a lower rep range. One of which is the ability to get to that high RPE or low RIR. So you can imagine if you were to compare a 5 rep set and a 15 rep set, in both of which you're getting 2 reps shy of failure. In the 15 rep set, there's going to be a lot more just genuinely painful reps than in the 5 rep set. And that's just from there being more reps in general. So it can be easier to get into those sort of effective ranges with lower rep sets. Another reason is that some exercises just feel better or feel worse with higher or lower rep sets. High rep squats just suck. Low rep, heavy hip thrusts can be awkward to get into. And so if an exercise just feels better using higher reps or low reps to you, I think that's a perfectly fine reason to opt for different rep ranges. And then any other form of personal preference is also just a fine idea. Because again, preference should drive a lot of the reasons why you do anything in your training. There are some people who argue that higher rep sets are safer than lower rep sets, but there's really just no evidence to back that claim. And weightlifting in general has an injury rate of about 1 to 4 injuries per 1,000 participation hours, which as far as recreational activities go, that's really low. So safety is kind of an reason to choose higher or lower reps, but anything else, I think there are reasons why you can choose higher or lower reps and be justified, whether that's getting to a lower RIR more easily, you just prefer it, or whatever. So that's all I got for this video. I really appreciate you being here, and I will see you next time.